Hello everyone and welcome back to my Warhammer 40k guides. I am Brady and today I will be giving you a patron requested video which is Deep Strike Denial. So first off, thanks to my generous patron Yennymouse for the idea for this video topic and for sponsoring this video through Patreon. For those of you who are unaware, I have a new Patreon tier that you can sign up for that allows you to request a video topic for the channel, which is what Yennymouse did and why I am covering this video topic. So if that interests you and you would like a video topic of your own to get covered, well then feel free to check me out on Patreon. So with that said, and without wasting any more time, let's get into what you guys and gals came here for, and let's talk about Deep Strike Denial. So Deep Strike Denial is exactly what it sounds like. It's denying area for enemy deep strikes. So what are deep strikes, you may ask? Well, normal deep strikes are when units start from off the board in reserve and then come down onto the table on turn 2 or 3 anywhere on the board but more than 9 inches away from enemy models. So for example, like Terminators or Jump Pack Marines. Then there is also what I like to call teleporting deep strikes, which is when a unit is already on the table but uses an ability, spell, or stratagem to get picked up off of the table and then placed anywhere on the board more than 9 inches away from enemy models. This type of deep strike isn't limited to turn 2 or 3 though, and can actually happen on turn 1 as well since the unit didn't come in from reserves and they were already on the table. Examples of teleporting deep strikes would be the Blood Angel stratagem upon Wings of Fire, the Gate of Infinity spell from Grey Knights, and the Jump spell from Orcs. So depending on what army or armies you are currently facing, you might need to prepare for enemy deep strikes on turn 1, while other armies you can wait until turn 2 to prepare, and against armies with no deep strike options, then you can get away without preparing at all, at least when it comes to your deployment and how to play out the game. So that would be my first tip. Learn which armies and units can teleport deep strike on turn 1, and which armies and units can normal deep strike on turn 2 or 3. This will help you make decisions on how to prepare for these deep strikes so that your opponent doesn't catch you off guard or get more out of their deep strikes than they should had you prepared for them. The best way to do this is to study all of the units and armies in the game and learn for yourself. But admittedly, as someone that tries to do this, it is incredibly difficult since there are so many units, armies, stratagems, and spells in the game, so it takes a lot of time and brain power to do so. But if you don't want to study every unit, stratagem, and spell in the game, you can always just ask your opponent before each game, do you have anything that can deep strike normally or teleport on turn 1, and do you have any stratagems or spells that allow you to put units into deep strike or teleport? And the vast majority of opponents will be honest and let you know if any units or spells or stratagems in their army are capable of these things. Note though that they do not have to tell you if they are actually going to go through with teleporting or deep striking units, but they do have to tell you if it's possible for those units to do so. So for example, they could say my Terminators can deep strike, but then during deployment they opt to put their Terminators on the table instead of in deep strike. And this is perfectly okay, since they don't have to tell you their strategy, but they do have to inform you of the unit's capabilities if you ask, so keep this in mind. Now that you know how to discover if the army you're up against is capable of these things, now you need to plan for them. First thing I suggest has to do with building your list for the game or games if you're attending a tournament. I suggest that when building your list, you put in cheap units that can act as a screen for your army. A screen is basically units that you can use to provide a meat shield for your actual army. For some examples, good screening units would be Astra Militarum Infantry, Space Marine Scouts, AdMech Rangers, Chaos Cultists, Chaos Brimstone Horrors, Chaos Nurglings, Necron Scarabs, Tyranid Ripper Swarms or Gaunts, basically any cheap units that you don't necessarily care about losing because their damage potential isn't all that great when compared to other units in your list. Every army in the game has at least one unit that is good for screening, and they are usually the cheapest units for those armies, like the examples I gave previously. There are times when you can deny area with more expensive units though, as long as they are long range and they are in your backfield, but I will go over that a bit more in the example that I will be getting to. A good trait to consider for screening units as well is how many bodies that unit consists of. For example, cultists have 10 bodies to work with, while something like Nurglings only have 3. And this is when talking about the minimum sized units. And in my opinion, you want to use minimum sized units for your screen, and I will explain a little bit more about that later. But this means with 10 bodies, you can cover a larger area than you would be able to with a unit consisting of less models. This will help with the next part of the video where I go over how to properly screen for your army and how to deny deep strike area. So now that you know how to learn about which armies can teleport and deep strike, and you know what a screening unit is, let's get into how to actually use this knowledge in game. So essentially what it boils down to is that your screening units are going to be used to deny deep strike area for your opponents, and now I will go over how to actually implement this in your games. So for our first example, let's say your army is Ultramarines with Guard allies, and you are against Thousand Suns with Demon allies. And at the beginning of the game, you asked your opponent if they can teleport or deep strike anything. And they informed you that the Scarab Occult Terminators can normal deep strike, and that their Zangor Shaman with a relic can teleport deep strike itself and another friendly Thousand Suns unit on turn 1, which you can probably determine is the blob of Zangors that they have. They should also inform you that all of the demons they have from the Chaos Demon Codex can deep strike as well. So now you have to think to yourself which of these units are actually going to deep strike, because again, like I mentioned earlier, they have to tell you what can deep strike, but they don't have to tell you if it's actually going to deep strike. So looking at their list, you can see a bunch of Plague Bearers, which you can probably assume are going to be a screen for all of the Thousand Suns characters. So they're probably not going into deep strike because they can't screen for the Thousand Suns characters if they're not on the board. You can then assume that the Scarab Occult Terminators are probably going to deep strike, since they don't want them on the board to get shot off before they can drop in and use their bolters and kill some stuff. And then, like I mentioned, you can probably already assume that that one big blob of Zangors that they have is going to be the target of their relic teleport. So now, going based off of all of that, we've determined that we really only have to watch out for the turn 1 deep strike from the Zangors and the turn 2 or turn 3 deep strike from the Scarab Occult Terminators. So now we know that we have 2 waves of deep strike to fend off, one that could possibly come on turn 1 and the other one that has to come on turn 2 or turn 3. So now when deploying your army, you need to set up a proper screen for it. So first off, look at the board where the objectives are placed and where the terrain is placed and all that stuff, and decide your battle plan. Which way is your army going to move? How many turns will it take to get there? Where is your opponent's army going to move? All of these things have to be considered if you're trying to play the game at a high level. After you've decided your battle plan and how you think the movement of the board is going to go down, now you actually have to deploy your army. I'm going to go a bit more in depth in all aspects of deployment in a separate video very soon as well, so keep an eye out for that video if you are hoping to learn more about deployment in general. But for this video, let's stick to Deep Strike Denial. So now that you have an idea of how you want to deploy and where you think your opponent will deploy, you need to set up a good screen to stop their deep strike shenanigans. So since we're playing Space Marines with Guard in this example, we could have the perfect screening units for mitigating the amount of damage we take from the deep strikes, since we most likely have some Space Marine Scouts and also Astra Militarum Infantry in our list, which in my opinion are the best units for denying deep strike currently, at least on the Imperium side of things. So knowing your opponent can teleport a unit on turn 1 if they choose to do so, and knowing that they need to be more than 9 inches away from your units when they do so, you can use your scout's ability to be deployed outside of your deployment zone to take up area in front of your actual army. Then afterwards, you can place the guardsmen in your deployment behind them on the front lines. These units now create a big no landing zone for deep strikes, because as you can see, there is literally no area for the enemy to land close to your actual forces because of all of the area that those units are taking up. Remember, the enemy deep strikes have to land 9 inches away from any of your units, so the scouts and the guardsmen are creating this barrier that they just can't hop into. So because of how we place these units, their only options are in between their army and your scouts, or very far off to the side, meaning they are nowhere near your good units, and your good units will be safe behind your screen. Also, don't forget about the sides and the back side of your forces. Use some more scouts or guardsmen to cover these areas as well. This is important because your army is most likely going to want to move up the board to grab objectives, or to get line of sight if needed, or to get some of your units into combat like Guilliman and Smash Captains. Putting these screening units all around your army means that when you move up the board, you're still covered from all sides. And as you've probably noticed, I really spaced out the models in these units to cover as much area as possible using their 2-inch coherency. This is key to denying as much area as possible with the least amount of units. This is why I mentioned earlier that when picking screening units, you should always consider how many models are in the minimum sized unit, and you want to take the minimum sized unit because then that means it's less points that you give away when those units inevitably die, which means overall that you're probably going to get better trades. So also getting back to what I said earlier about using units as a screen for deep strike denial that aren't necessarily meant to be screening units, as you can see in this example, we brought some basilisks and we're using those to block the area at the back of our army. This is alright because the basilisks aren't going to need to move to gain line of sight, and they're not going to need to get in range of enemy units because they have something like a 240-inch range, so they could shoot the next table over if they really wanted to. So because these units aren't going to need to move, and they aren't going to need line of sight, you can use them to deny the backfield area. But be careful when doing this and make sure you don't leave any holes. And if there are holes, we'll fill them up with your guardsmen or your scouts, because you definitely don't want your basilisks getting charged and then becoming useless for the rest of the game. So make sure when you're spacing your army out that everything is protected. If your army doesn't have access to units that can be deployed outside of your deployment, like the scouts, then just mimic what I did with the guard, but pull your main forces a bit farther back from your front line, so that way if the enemy does deep strike turn 1 in charge, they can't kill the screen unit that's out front and then tag the units that are behind them in close combat to stop them from shooting. With Ultramarines, this isn't really a huge issue because you can still leave combat and shoot at a -1 anyways because of their chapter tactic, but for other armies that don't have that benefit, you might want to be a few more inches back to stop yourself from getting tagged in combat after they charge and kill your screen. So getting back to our example, now if the enemy wants to teleport deep strike on turn 1, all they can kill are some guardsmen or scouts, and that's a good thing for you. Those units are brought in your list with the idea that if something has to die, then it's better that it's them instead of your Hellblasters or your Intercessors or your Devastators and so on. This game is all about trading units after all, and you want to get the most out of your trades. Sure, they can teleport their 160-ish point Zangor unit to kill your 55-point unit of scouts or 40-point unit of guardsmen, but now on your turn, you just shoot the Zangors to death and net yourself a good trade. So now let's go on to turn 2. Let's say they opted to not teleport deep strike their Zangors on turn 1 since they had no good targets and they didn't want to get out traded. And then let's say they opted to smite your scouts to death with all of the Thousand Sun characters to give their army more area to deep strike with in future turns. Well, now you just adjust your screen to continue to take up as much area as possible to deny those good deep strikes. And if you do this correctly, then your opponent won't have anywhere optimal to actually drop their Terminators. So now let's talk about another example. And let's say you're playing the same Ultramarine plus Guard list and you're against Blood Angels and Guard. And on turn 1, your opponent killed a good chunk of your screen somehow, most likely was shooting from the Guard. Well, now you have to screen with your next best units. Well, your first screen would be your guardsmen and your scouts, since that's pretty much their intended purpose. But if those units happen to die and you still need a screen afterwards, we'll go to the next best unit to do that. And then when those die, I would then use either the Devastators or the Intercessors as the new screen, depending on the matchup and which units I cared less for in that matchup. Basically, you go down the list and continually screen with the units you care the least about when it comes to putting out damage. This doesn't mean that it's okay to only bring 3 units of scouts as your screen and then expect to start screening with other units right away after those scouts inevitably die. This just means that in the worst case scenarios, that if all 3 of your scouts units die and all 6 of your guard units die, then you start screening with your next best units. You don't want to have to screen with your good units, so make sure that you bring enough actual screening units to try to avoid this. But again, if the situation does arise, just go down the list and figure out which units are the least important in your matchup and use those to screen after your screen inevitably dies. So with all that said, I have a couple more tips for denying deep strike area and screening before I end this video. So the second last tip, and probably the most important tip I can give, is make sure that you preemptively move your screen in such a way so that it can continue to protect where your army is going to be at the end of your turn. For example, let's say you wanted to countercharge a unit that charged your screen while shooting the enemies that are behind them. Make sure that you take into account where your forces are going to be after they make that charge. This way you don't leave a hole in your defenses and allow your opponent to countercharge your countercharge. So just try to figure out where you need your screens to be based off of where you think your army will be at the end of your turn. And the final tip I'm going to give in this video is, let's say you fended off and destroyed all of the enemy's deep striking threats, all of their charge threats, and all of their melee threats from the opponent. Now your screen is free to go grab objectives or gain board control by move blocking enemy units, which I talk about in my video titled Board Control, or they can just supplement your overall damage alongside your main force. So I think that about covers everything, or at least the basics when it comes to deep strike denial. So to summarize this video, learn which armies and units can deep strike and or teleport. You can do this by studying or by asking the right questions to your opponent at the beginning of your game. Use cheap units to screen and deny area for your army. If those units die and you still need a screen or to deny area, then use the next least useful units you have depending on your matchup. Make sure to use the 2-inch coherency on your screening units to take up as much area as possible with the least amount of units. Use units that have long range to deny backfield area, but make sure to still protect them as well if needed with your normal screening units while still protecting your main force. If you do decide to countercharge units that are in your backfield to deal with them that way while shooting at other units, make sure to still preemptively move your screen to protect where your army is going to be at the end of your turn. And that's about it for the basics. The rest will come down to game knowledge and experience in knowing how to deal with certain situations that may arise in your games. So thanks again to Yenimouse for this video topic, and thanks to all of my current patrons. Without you guys and gals, the channel would not be where it's at today, so I can't thank you all enough. I love you all. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed the video. I have a few more patron requested videos that I'm going to cover over the next week or so a lot of content will be coming your way, and I hope you all enjoy it. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Happy wargaming.